Hello and welcome to Skills and Automation. My name is Ash and today we're going to build an Excel VBA project where we update an Excel pivot report and send it using Outlook. We will also create a schedule to send the email at 6 a.m. daily. This is one of the most common tasks I've come across in my career. As an analyst in the corporate world, you are bound to send daily reports such as daily sales, out of stock reports, etc. Each of those tasks will involve some form of copying, pasting, modifying, refreshing, and emailing. This project is a great way to automate those tasks, and perhaps it could give you ideas to incorporate in other scenarios that you encounter. Before I start, I want to cover a bit of housekeeping. We are building an end-to-end solution, and I will be writing the code from zero. This project will be using basic to intermediate VBA skills. However, even if you are just starting out in VBA, it would definitely add value to watch and listen to me talk through the code and understand the overall approach that I use. Also, sometimes it's just beneficial to understand what all is possible. Now, let's move on to the detailed scenario. The report that we will be mailing is just a summary of all outstanding unpaid invoices. This data would traditionally be contained within an ERP such as JDE, SAP, etc. The scenario on this slide is a list of activities an analyst is expected to perform manually. The scope of this project is to automate all these activities plus create a schedule to send the email out every morning. So here's the scenario. IT saves a data dump of all invoices daily in a folder location. You already have a separate Excel template file with the pivot table summarizing the data by customer. First thing every morning, you copy the data from the CSV file and paste it into the Excel template file. You then refresh the pivot table to update the values. Next, you save a copy with today's date in the file name. Finally, you email the report out to other team members. Now, let's look at the automation approach that we will be using. A Windows task in the task scheduler will open a .bat file at 6 a.m. every morning. If you haven't used a .bat file before, that's absolutely fine. A .bat file or a batch file is a special text file that we will use to open the Excel macro file. Just a note here, it is possible to open the macro file directly using the task scheduler. However, the behavior via .bat file is more consistent and it's my preferred method. Once the macro file is open, the following code will be triggered. How? We will call the code using the workbook open event. Up on top, we've made the assumption that IT places data into a CSV file between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. Instead of copying and pasting the data into our template file where the pivot table is stored, we will simply create a link table to the CSV file. Now, all we have to do is refresh the connection for the link table and then refresh the pivot table. Next, we save a copy of the file, or in other words, archive it. We'll also attach this file to the email later on. Next, we will extract a list of email IDs of all the recipients of the report from another Excel file. If there is any error up until now, we will not proceed with sending the report. Instead, we will send an email back to us containing the error message of what went wrong. This could be errors such as IT hasn't updated the CSV file, or there are no email IDs in the email list file, and that would be the end of the code. However, if there is no error, then we will create the email, attach the current copy of the report template, and send it to the right team members. I hope that what we are about to build sounds interesting up until now. Let's move on and look at a demo in action. In the demo, we will just manually trigger the macro workbook. Let's first look at the CSV file. It's right here in data. It's got some standard information related to aged invoices. We can see invoice number, invoice date, amount, etc. Next, let's look at the report template file. We won't be copying and pasting data from the CSV file. Instead, we will create a link table to the CSV file. Here's the link table. You can look at the properties, come to data, queries and connection, hover on the query. In data sources, we can see it's connected to the CSV file. Next, let's look at the connection type. In existing connections, right click, edit connection properties, definition, we can see that the connection type is an OLADP query. Now the objective of the macro is to first refresh this connection so that this link table gets updated, and next we will refresh the pivot table that is connected to this link table. So here's the pivot table. This is just a classic pivot table which summarizes invoice amount by customer and product group. Now let's have a look at the email list. So this file contains a list of all email IDs who we are going to send the report out to. I've just repeated the same email ID again and again. This is the project email ID, and the purpose of entering it multiple times is to show that the code will work on multiple email IDs as well. Now finally, let's look at the archive. Currently it's empty. One of the objectives of the macro is to create a copy of the report template and save it in the archive folder. Now finally, let's move on to the actual macro. So I've created a button out here to manually trigger the macro. But before we do that, let's quickly glance through the code. So here's a sub procedure. We're going to get to building this shortly. And we can see a few functions out here as well. For now, let's manually run this macro. I'm going to click on run. You can see it's running. Great. The first part, our expectation is to see a copy of the file created in the archive folder. Just wait for it to get created. Okay, see something is happening. So here the file has been created. It is a copy of the report template with today's date inside the file name. Next, we should email out the copy to our recipients. I can see the message is being sent right now. So it's in my sent box. It should arrive in the inbox shortly. You can see it's coming. Great. Let's have a look at it now. We can see some generic text in the email body. One thing to note is that we have today's name inside the email body. This is some dynamic text that we will look at when we are building the actual code. We can see the signature of the analyst. We can see the 3 recipients out here. And finally, the report has been attached. So looks like everything has worked right now. So now let's try a few combinations to complete this demo. For one thing, let's test that our connection actually works. So right now, let's open this report template file. I just want you to note the final grand total number out here. We will change the value in the CSV file to an insanely high amount, and then we will re-trigger the macro and see if the report now reflects the new value. Let's do that now. Let's go to data. Open the CSV file. I'm just going to change the value in the final cell. Make this 15 million. It's 150 million. That definitely should pop. Save this. Close the CSV file. Come back to the macro. And let's run it again. Let's open the mailbox. I can see a message being sent right now. Okay, that's great. One message got sent. Okay, I'm not going to wait for it to come in the inbox. Let's just examine the file in the send box. Opening the report template. Okay, looks like it's worked. The previous value was, I think, 23 million. This is 170, so definitely the new data point has been refreshed. So that part of the macro seems to be working correctly. Let's close this. Now let's test one single error handler. What we're going to do is we'll blank out all the email IDs in the email list file. The macro is currently sending to these 3 recipients. Let's just blank this out and save it. So now the macro does not have anyone to send the emails to. So what should happen right now is instead of sending the report template, we should receive an email error stating that we are not able to send the email with a particular message. Let's run this. Let's go to our inbox. These are my previous 2 messages. I'm just going to delete that. Okay, something's being sent. Okay, so we got a failure message out here. It says failure to deliver aged invoice report in the subject. Notice it had just been sent to the one person, the originator. The email body says email aborted due to no trigger in the email list or no email ID. For now, I'll just ask you to ignore this part. It's a fail safe that I've added, but we will just look at the no email ID part and just confirm that the error handler is working fine as well. So that's the demo. Let's move on to actually building the macro. Actually, there's one more step we need to complete before we start coding. In the spirit of doing everything from scratch, let's create the report template as well. It's super easy. You can skip this step if you want. On a high level, all you need to know is that the report file contains a link table connected to the CSV file and a pivot table based on that linked table. However, there is value in going through this step, as I would like to emphasize the importance of preparing the data and project environment using as much Excel as possible and using VBA only when necessary. Let's open a blank Excel file. Next, we'll create the link table. Go to data, get data from file, and then choose from text CSV, or we can directly choose from text CSV right here. We'll select our CSV file and click import. We want to load the data as is, so we will click load. There, that's our link table. A new worksheet has also been created. Notice the worksheet has the same name as the CSV file. Also, the table has the same name as the CSV file as well. Now, I want this project to reflect real life scenarios as close as possible. So let's add a column of formulas to the table. At work, you would almost always do some calculations on the raw data when preparing any report. I want to get the product family or product group for each of these products. For that, I will create a new mapping sheet and paste a product map there. Let's do that now. This is just a table of product code and the respective product groups. I'll just copy this over to our template file and I'll paste this here. Now we can do our VLOOKUPs. We'll come to the link table. In cell K2, we'll type our VLOOKUP formula is equal to VLOOKUP. Select the product code, comma. We'll select our range now. I'll just hard code this range, F4, comma. I want to select the second column and I want an exact match. Notice the formula gets automatically replicated across the rest of the rows. Let's rename the column header to product group. Now let's create a pivot table. Click once anywhere in this data table. Now we'll go to insert, pivot table. Notice in the table range, the name of the link table is already selected. This is because our cursor was in the data range. If it wasn't, you would need to type in the table name manually here. The takeaway here is that we are creating a pivot table using the table and not the physical data range. This will make the pivot range dynamic and the range will automatically readjust whenever we bring in new data. Of course, we need to refresh the pivot table each time for that. Now back to our pivot table. Yes, I want to create in a new worksheet. Okay. Now let's prepare the pivot view. We want customer in rows, product group in the columns, and invoice amount in values. In the pivot options, I will choose the classic pivot layout. Just one small thing, I will just change this number format to currency. There, that looks good. I'll just rename these sheets now. I'll rename this to pivot, our mapping sheet to product map. Next, let's hide the product map sheet. Always best to only display necessary information in any report. Now let's save this file. We'll save this file as aged invoice template in the project space folder. There, all done. One final thing, and I promise we'll move straight to the VBA code. I just want to spend a moment to recognize what we have done till now. The act of creating a table has saved us lots of code. Without a table, if we refresh the pivot, we would need to change the data range each time. Also, each time we get new raw data, we would need to extend the formulas to make sure it covers all the rows. We don't need to do this with a table. Lastly, we don't need to open the original CSV file, copy data, and paste data into the report template file. We just need to refresh the link table. Of course, we don't need the table, and we could do everything in VBA through code. But really, why bother? We can save a lot of additional code which makes our code more readable and easier to manage. This is how I design any of my projects. I prepare the data as much as possible in Excel and use VBA only when necessary. Great. Now we can move on to the actual VBA code. We are going to progressively build the macro in parts using working prototypes. In other words, we will build a part of the macro, test that it works, and then move on to the next part. For the first part, we will build a code that sends an email with the report template as an attachment. Now, let's open an Excel file. Let's just save and name this first. I'm going to name this file email console. We will save this file as a .xlsp. It's my personal preference to use .xlsp macro files instead of .xlsm. This is mostly related to better performance due to smaller file size. While it may not be applicable to this project, it's just my habit now. You can save the file as .xlsm if you want. Save. Let's open the VB editor, Alt F11. Let's create a new module. Let's declare a public constant for our primary folder path. We will use this folder path as our primary folder path. I'm just going to Control-C it. Declaring the folder path as a public constant will allow us to use this folder path across multiple sub-procedures. So first, public const. I'll name the constant s folder path as a string. And we'll paste the folder path that we just copied out here. And I'll add a backslash at the end. Now, let's create a first sub-procedure. We'll call it create age invoice report. The first thing we can do is set the screen updating to false at the start and true at the end. This will make most of your applications open in background, will reduce the fluttering of the screen, and also improve overall speed. So application dot screen updating, set it as false. Now let's copy this, paste it, and set it to true at the end. We can do the same for display alerts. It will disable any default messages such as the do you want to save change message that pops out when we are about to close an Excel file. So again, application, choose display alerts, set it to false, copy this, paste it at the bottom, turn it back to true. Let's create a string variable for the file path of the report template file. Let's dim it. We'll call it source file name. And we want to save the file path as a string variable. Now let's assign a value to this string variable. Let's copy, paste. For the first part, we'll use the constant that we had declared earlier. Now we'll add the template file name using the ampersand symbol. This is our report template file. Copy the name. Before I proceed, I just want to state that I usually declare my variables right before I need them. I find this easier to manage. You may, however, choose to declare all the variables initially. Either way works. Now, to send an email via Outlook and to access the various features of Outlook, we need to create a reference to the Outlook object library. To add a reference to Outlook, we need to go to Tools, References, and scroll down till we first see Microsoft, and then we'll search for Outlook. There. Tick this, click OK. The biggest advantage of setting references is that we get to access IntelliSense, which makes it much easier to write code. This method is called early binding. There is another technique called late binding where we don't need to set the reference. However, for this video, we will use early binding. To be able to access the various properties of an Outlook email, we need the following lines of code. First, declare a variable to reference the Outlook application. So dim, we'll call it OApp as Outlook.application. Then we'll create a new instance of the Outlook application. So now set this variable is equal to new Outlook.application. Next, declare a new variable to reference the email class. This allows us to access various properties of an email such as the mail to, mail from, body, etc. Dim, we'll call it omail as Outlook.mailItem. Now we'll create the actual email object. So set omail. We'll use a create item method and choose the omail item constant. Enter. If this was a bit too much, just note here, what we're really after is the Outlook email object, omail. You can treat these 4 lines of code as static and just necessary to create the email object. So just copy paste if you need, and don't forget to add the reference. A brief note here, I will be uploading a detailed tutorial covering how to send Outlook emails using Excel VBA. You can always refer to that as well. Now we can fill the properties of the email object. Since there are a lot of properties, we can use the with statement. Omail. I'll first end it. Now let's start filling the properties. First 2. We'll assign a blank value to all the properties right now. All we're doing is trying to create a blank email template. Subject. We want to send this email using HTML format. Hence, we will use the .html body property. For now, we just want to display the email. If you want to send it, we would use the .send property. But for now, I will just comment this out. Let's check and see if this works. Great. We've created a blank email template now. Close. Now let's add our report template as an attachment. We can use the variable that we had created earlier. So I'm going to copy this. Before the display, I'll add the attachment. .add. And we'll place the source file name. Control V. Let's test and see if this works. Great. You've got a blank email template with the attachment. Now let's fill the other properties as well, such as to, subject, body, etc. We can dim them all as strings. Body, to, subject, and attachment. Now let's assign values to each of these. For the body, we'll need to write the text using HTML. Double quotes. Good morning. Now to move to the next line in an email body, we can use the line breaks. This is one line break. Let's add another one. Now to move to the next line, in the VBA code, we can use an ampersand and an underscore. add some text. Now I want to add today's date out here. So I will exit out of this text, apostrophe. I can add the today's date using the date function from VBA. However, I want it to appear in a particular way. Hence, I'll use the format function as well. So format, we want to format the date, and the format type, I'll just create a custom type. That's it. Now let's get back to the body statement. Open double quotes, 2 more line breaks. Next line. Okay, that's our body. Now let's move on to the next variable. For now, in the to variable, we will just add our project email ID. We will change this later on and extract multiple IDs from our email list file. We'll add a subject now. We'll add the attachment. The attached variable will be nothing but the source file name variable. Now I know this s_attach variable is kind of redundant and we could just use the s_source file name variable directly. But I feel this way makes it more readable, and when writing code, I tend to favor readability as long as it's not compromising performance too much. Now let's add these variables to our mail properties. Copy to, copy the subject, copy the body, and replace this variable with our attached variable. Let's run this and see what we get. Great. I can see my to, subject, email body, and we can even see today's date appearing inside it. And we have our attachment. Everything looks to be working fine. There is just one thing though. We don't have any signature out here. Let's add that next. Now I have an email signature saved in Outlook that I want to use to access signatures in personal Outlook. Let's open Outlook, go to File, Options, Mail, and come to Signatures. We have this Analyst signature saved and we want to attach this. And now let's look at how to attach this to the email that we are about to send out. To add the signature, there are 2 steps. First, we need to display the email before we fill in any other properties. Next, we need to add the .html body once again to our body variable. And that's it. Let's run this and check if that's worked. Great, I can see the signature now. Everything seems to be working fine. So the first part is over. So far, we have created an Outlook email and attached the report template. We've also made the body of the email dynamic by adding a function to display the current date. Lastly, we have included the signature of our analyst in the email as well. Now, let's move on to the next part of the code. Now, before we start adding more code, I would like to split the existing code into multiple sub-procedures or functions to improve readability. I know I keep saying this in all my videos. However, readability is super important. I've wasted too much company time revisiting my code and trying to figure out what I've done. So we're going to create a function to handle the act of sending an email. So basically this part of the code right here. Please refer to my Outlook tutorial if you would like to learn more. I use the exact same code there. We will shift the Outlook declarations and the Outlook email properties out of the main sub-procedure and into a new private function. We'll give it a name. Now let's add our arguments. Our arguments will be nothing but the to, the subject, the body, and the attachment. They will all be strings. And lastly, I'm going to set this to return a Boolean value. The as Boolean part at the end will ensure that the function returns a true or a false value. The reason for using a function and not another sub-procedure is error handling. I would like the function to return true if the email is sent successfully, and false if there was some error and the email was not sent. Now let's cut the Outlook declarations and the properties out of the main sub-procedure and paste it into our function. Let's update the variables to our arguments. Now I would like this function to return true if it reached this part successfully and there were no errors. So let's copy this part and set it to true. Next, let's add some error handling. On error, go to the system error handler line that we are just about to create. So if there's an error in any part of this code, I would like this function to return a false value. Let's copy this and set it to false. Just one slide part more. If it's reached this part, I want it to exit the function. Great, that's our function. Now let's go back to our main procedure and call our function from there. We will say that if there was a problem in sending the email, or in other words, if the function returns false, then we want a message saying the email couldn't be sent. If not, let's copy this function name, add in our 4 variables. Let's first end this if statement. So the default value of this function is true. So what we're saying here is that if it's not true, then we want a message saying that we could not send the email. Otherwise, we'll create a message saying that we could send the email successfully. So add in the message box here. Else, the mail was sent successfully. For now, we will just stick to messages, but in the final state, we will replace the messages with error emails back to ourselves. Okay? So that completes this function. Let's run this code and see if it works well. We need to click inside the main sub-procedure and not in the function. So let's click here and run it. Great. Basically the same result as the first part of our code, but this just confirms that our function is being called successfully through our main sub-procedure. And we can also see the message that the file was mailed successfully. Click OK. Moving on to the next part of our code, we'll add 2 file paths as string variables. One for the location where we want to save a copy of our template file, and the other for the original CSV data file. So this is where we want to save a copy of a report template file, and this is the location of a CSV file. Now let's assign values, or rather file paths, to these 2 variables. We can start with our folder path constant. Within the broader folder path, we want to specifically save the file within the archive folder. So let's add that to this variable. Give it a backslash. Now we'll add the file name that we want to save it as. We'll call it aged invoice. And while saving the copy, let's add today's date within the file name as well. For that, let's exit out of the double quotes first. And we'll do the same trick that we used down here. But we'll just format this slightly differently. That should work. Lastly, let's add the file extension. Okay, now let's add the location of the CSV file. It's saved inside the main folder path, inside the data subfolder. And let's add the name of the file. Next, we'll check whether the CSV file has been refreshed or not. If you recall, we have made the assumption that the data dump will be refreshed by IT between 12 AM and 6 AM. So, if the last save date of the CSV file is not within this period, then we can infer that the file hasn't been refreshed. In that case, we won't send the report because it will essentially be the same as yesterday's copy. Instead, we'll send us back an error message. We can get the last modified date of the CSV file using the file date time function. Let's first create a date variable to save the last saved date of the CSV file. Let's assign the save date to this variable now. File date time function. For the path name, we can use the CSV file name variable that we have created. Now I want to compare this versus today's date. However, let's see how date is saved. Looks like it's in the short date format. So we can convert this dResult variable into the short date format as well using this format function. The same dResult variable. And we want the short date format. Okay, let's step out of this code first. Next, we can check if this dResult variable is equal to today's date or not. If it's not, then we can give ourselves a message back saying that the file has not been refreshed, and we'll exit out of this sub procedure. We need to turn back all the screen updating and the display alerts before we exit out of the function. Now exit sub and close the if statement. Okay, let's see if this works or not. So I've deliberately saved an older version of the CSV file. So we should definitely get an error and exit the sub. Let's see if that works. I'm just going to put a breakpoint on this if statement. Okay, let's see what the values are. Yes, this is 17th of 2nd. And today is the 20th of the 2nd. This should definitely give an error. Let's step through the code now using F8. Message box. And we exit the sub. As you can see, the CSV file has got a date modified of the 17th of the 2nd. So that part of the function is working fine. Now let's see if the opposite part works. Let's update the CSV file. It's going to make a minor change. Save this. The date now changes to today. So this won't satisfy the condition of our if statement, and we should be able to move past it onto the next part of our code. Let's give it a go. Again, I'm going to put a breakpoint on the if statement. Let's run the code. Let's hover over the variables to check the values. 20th. So this does not satisfy the if statement. The code will just ignore it and move to the next part. Great. That part seems to be working. Now let's create the function to refresh the connections and the pivot table in the report file. Note, the reason for using a function is the same as before. We want to return a true if the actions within the function were performed successfully. If not, we want to return a false. Let's create a private function. Let's assign a name to it. For the parameters, we will first take the location where the original report template file is saved and also add the location where we want to save a copy of the report template. Both will be string variables, and we'll set this function to return a Boolean value. First of all, check if there is a copy of the report file saved in the destination location with the same file name. If yes, then we will delete that file. To check if a file exists, we will use the dir function. And what exists? Whether the destination file exists. And if it does, we will delete off the file. For that, we will use the kill function. Now let's first open the report template file. We'll create a workbook variable. Now we'll set it to open the source file. Workbooks. We'll use the .open method. And what do we want to open? The source file name. Now that the workbook is open, let's first refresh the connection. Now we'll dim a connection variable. As workbook connection. We will use the for each statement. For each con in wSource dot connections. Let's first close this for statement. So what are we going to do out here? We will do two things. We will definitely refresh the connection, but we'll also set the background query to false. The background query step is optional. I'm adding this in case there is a lag in the refresh. In that case, the query would refresh in the background and the code will skip ahead without waiting for the query to complete. The data wouldn't refresh completely and we would get the wrong or incomplete values in our report. Hence, we can add this step. If this doesn't work for you, you can omit it, but please keep the refresh part. We will choose the OLEDB connection. Why OLEDB connection? Let's go back to our report template. And let's have a look at the data connection properties. Come to definition. Here, you can see that the connection type is an OLEDB query. Now we'll set the background query property to false. This will ensure that the data refresh will pull in all the values from the CSV file before moving on to the next part of the code. I'll admit that this is a slight bit of overkill because we just have a CSV connection. However, this query or this line of code is super handy when we are connecting to an SQL database. So I'm just going to leave it in there for your knowledge. However, if you're trying to run this code and this part does not work, please feel free to omit this. Now we'll add the actual refresh part. Great. This should refresh our connections. Now I do know that we have only one connection in the file and we do not need such a generic code to refresh all the connections. However, in order to refresh that one particular connection that we have in the report template file, we would need to know the connection name and hard code it out here. And we should always try and avoid using hard codes wherever possible. So for that reason, I prefer using generic queries like this. Now let's do a similar thing to refresh the pivot table. When we create a pivot table, Excel takes a copy of the source data and stores it in a pivot cache. So in order to refresh the pivot table, we need to refresh the pivot cache. So let's dim a pivot cache variable. Now let's do a similar thing what we did back up here. We'll use the for each statement. Dot pivot cache. We'll close the for statement and we'll refresh the pivot cache. Okay, now let's save the changes. Now let's save a copy of this file. Dot save as. And we'll save it as the destination file name that we have up here. Next, let's close the file. Save changes as false. Next, let's open the copy that we have just created. Since this is the copy that we'll be sending out, we should tidy the file a bit. Let's dim in new workbook variable and set it as the destination file name. We're going to delete all the connections and queries in the file. If we don't, the user will get an ugly error ribbon in Excel stating that the file contains external connections and whether they want to enable or disable them. Best we delete them off. Let's dim an iteration variable as a long. Now we'll first delete all the connections in the file. So for I, now whenever you're deleting something, we always step backwards. We'll first say for all the connections in this file to 1 dot connections dot count to 1 and we'll step 1 backwards. Let's close the for connections, each connection or item dot delete. Let's do the same for queries. I've just replaced connections with queries. It's the exact same code. Great. Let's save the changes now. Let's close the destination file. If everything ran successfully till now, then we would like the function to return a true. Let's copy the name of the function and paste it here. set this as true. We can go ahead and exit the function. But if something goes wrong, we would need to add some error handlers that will do some action and set the function to return a false. We can add two error handlers in this case, one for the source file and another for the destination file. Why two error handlers? Firstly, if anything goes wrong when the source file is open, we need to close the source file and exit the function. Similarly, if anything goes wrong when the destination file is open, we need to close the destination file and exit the function. In order to do that, we need two separate lines of code, hence two separate error handlers. So let's go above where our source code begins and add the reference to our first error handler. Just gonna copy this line now and paste it above where the destination part begins. We can change this part to test, paste it below the exit function line. Change this to test. So what do we want to do out here? We want to close the source file. Let's do that. And we'll set the function to return a false value. We can do a similar thing for the destination error handler. Copy this, paste it, change this to test. Great, that looks good. Now let's go back to our main sub procedure and call this newly written function from there. We can add it before the email code. So in a similar concept to the email function, if not, the function name, bring in our source and destination file variables. Close the if statement. So if anything went wrong in this function, we'll return back a message saying that we could not create a copy and exit out of the sub procedure. So a message box, couldn't create a copy. Set back on the screen updating and display alerts. Okay, that was quite a bit of code. Now let's see if what we have put together works or not. Before I do that, let's comment the display and comment out the send so that right now we do not display the email. Instead, we'll send us an email. Let's save this first. Let's test our changes and run the sub procedure. Now for the first part, I'll come to my archive folder. We can see there is no file out here. Our expectation is that a file gets created. Yes, a file has been created. I can see something is being sent. Great, our email has been sent. And we have a message that the file was mailed successfully. However, I do notice one thing off out here. This seems to be our original template file, and our report copy has got today's date in the file name. And as per the original requirement, we want to send this copy and not the original template. So we need to fix that inside the code. Let's delete this email. Okay, so what went wrong? Yes, it looks like this statement is incorrect. So our attachment is still the original source file name. We need to replace this with the destination file name. So I'm going to copy this. And let's run this once again. File was mailed successfully. Okay. And let's see what was actually mailed out. Great. Looks like the copy was attached this time and not the original template. So everything seems to be working fine up until now. Let's move on to the next part of our code. In this section of the project code, we will extract the list of emails from a separate file where we store the emails of all the recipients of the report. There is one small thing we are going to add to this as well, but we'll talk about it when we get there. Let's create a new private function to extract the list of emails. Call it getEmail. And this time we want to return a string. So why a string? Let's bring up a new email. So imagine we want to send the email to 3 recipients. We would enter the email IDs into the to field like this, separated by a semicolon. So this is nothing but a string. Let's have a look at our email list file. This is a list of email IDs. So what we're going to do is iterate through each of these email IDs and add them into one string variable. Let's create variables for the email workbook and the 2 sheets inside the email workbook as a workbook, as worksheet. And we have one more worksheet out there. I'm just going to declare it first. Let's set each of these variables. Workbook.open. We'll use the folder path constant that we had created initially. And add the email list file name to it. Now let's set the worksheets. I'll just open the email list file and just copy the worksheet name. .sheets. And get the name of the second sheet. Okay, so let's address this second sheet now. What is the send file sheet? I haven't talked about it yet. I will need to skip to the end to explain this, so I hope you can follow along. In a nutshell, this is a failsafe that I've put in to prevent us from accidentally triggering the email procedure each time we open our macro file. Let me explain. In the final state, we will ensure that our macro fires off when we open the macro workbook. But suppose if you want to troubleshoot and don't want to fire off the macro, there is a way in Excel to do this. Instead of double clicking on the macro file, we can open the Excel application and open the workbook macro by going to File and Open. And while we click Open, we need to hold down the Shift key until the macro workbook opens. We could do this. I could do this. But I also see myself forgetting to push down the Shift key and accidentally sending off the report. Last thing I want is my boss and 50 other people to get a random report in the middle of the day. So we can add a failsafe. In this send file sheet, there is a value in the range B2. If this value is yes, then the macro will run as normal. If the value is no, then the macro will send back an error and we will exit the procedure, thereby not triggering the email. For the error, we'll just set the send to value to a blank string. Let's do that now. We'll dim the to variable as a string. So if this value is no, or if it is blank, we want to set the email to blank. Thereby, the macro will have no one to send the email to and it will automatically trigger the failsafe and exit the sub-procedure. If both those conditions are true, let's close the if statement first. Now, if either of these conditions are true, you want to set the to variable to a blank. Next, we'll go to line 1 where we'll close this workbook and exit the function. First, we'll close the workbook. We'll set this function to the to variable. And the function will end. However, if the value in the range B2 is yes, then we will move on to the next part of our code. Now let's find the last row in the range. We can do current regions and get the row count. Long dot range and current region from range A1 dot current region dot rows, and we'll count all the rows. Now we'll dim our iteration variable as a long. Now our email IDs start from row 2, so we'll start our for loop from 2 to the last row. Close the for loop. Now let's start assigning the to variable. we'll assign it to itself and the value in column A. Dot value. So for the first iteration, this will obviously be blank. Now we want to separate the email IDs with a semicolon. Let's add that. So this will add a semicolon after each email ID. But this brings us to one problem. We'll have a semicolon after the last email ID, and we don't want that. So what we need to do is when this for loop reaches the last email ID, let's take out the last semicolon. So if we reach the last row, close the if, and we'll assign the to variable to the left of itself less 1. So the entire length of the to variable less 1. Now let's exit the sub. Okay, once you've reached this part, we would have gathered all the email IDs. Then the code defaults to line 1 where we close the email workbook, assign the email IDs to the get email function, and now let's bring it back into our main sub procedure. Let's copy the name of this function, come to our main sub procedure. Let's replace this hard-coded to value to the value that comes out of our function. There are two possible values that come out of this function. One is a blank email ID or a filled out email ID. If the email ID is blank, we want to display a message and exit the sub procedure. Remember, the email ID will be blank for two conditions. First is if there are no email IDs out here, or if the trigger out here is either a no or there is a blank out here. However, if there is a yes in range B2 and if there is at least one email ID in range A2 onwards, then a sub procedure should run and continue to send the email. So now let's add some code to account for if there is no email ID returned by the get email function. So if our to variable is a blank, then let's close the if, give us back a message. The email is aborted either due to a no trigger or there is no email ID. And if that happens, we want to exit the sub. So we just copy these 3 lines of code here. Okay, so that's a function to get emails from an external Excel file. Let's now run this and see if it works. Click within a sub procedure and let's hit run. Okay, looks like it ran correctly. We get a success message. Okay, I'm pretty confident that we'll be sending our email. Yes, our email has gone as well. So the function works correctly if we are getting some email IDs. Now let's check whether our two error handlers work correctly or not. First, let's check what happens if there are no email IDs to send the report out to. Open the email list file. Let's blank out these email IDs. But instead of blanking these out, I'm just going to cut and paste it in a different column. As for the code, it will think there are no email IDs present because it is only looking in column A. Let's save and close this file. Let's go back to our code, run the macro again. Great. The email didn't get sent out. Instead, we got our error message. Click OK. Let's confirm that no email was sent out. The sent folder looks empty. Great. Next, let's test if the yes no trigger, or rather the failsafe that we have put in, works or not. Go back to our email list file. Let's first change the email IDs back, cut, and paste it in column A. Now let's come to the send file worksheet. This trigger email, let's change the yes to a no. Save, close the file, come back to our macro, and let's run it again. We get the same error message. That's good news. Both our error handlers are working. Click OK. Let's just change back the trigger to yes first. Yes, save, close. Okay, that was how to extract a list of emails from an external file. In the next section, we're going to replace the error messages with error emails. Okay, so now this is the final part of the macro. Let's create a sub procedure for the error email. Note this time we won't use a function since we don't want to return a value. The sub procedure will take an error reason as a string. What are these error reasons? These are nothing but the messages we have created throughout the original sub procedure. So now instead of a message box popping up, an email will be sent to us with the same message. I hope I'm clear on why we are doing this. The macro will be designed to run when we are not around. So there's no point in having error messages pop up and the macro come to a standstill because there will be nobody around to press that OK button. We rather have the macro exit gracefully and have an email sent back to us telling what went wrong. Also, if you have 2-3 such procedures running at different times in the morning, the failure of one will prevent the others from executing. Hence, it's important to close the macro completely if there's an error. Now let's create a private sub procedure for the error email. We'll assign one argument, that is the error reason, as a string. Now I can type all the Outlook declarations and Outlook properties here, but easier way is to come to our original Outlook function and just copy these declarations and the properties. We can change the error handler. We'll just say resume next. For the to, we'll just send it to the originator, which is the project email ID. We'll add a subject, just saying failure to deliver. The body will be the error reason. And we're not going to add any attachments this time. And that's it for this procedure. Let's go back to the main sub procedure and call these error emails. So I'm going to look for the message boxes within the sub procedure. Below the message box, we can call the error email and pass in the error reason. We haven't declared this yet, so let's do that. Since we'll be using throughout the code, we'll declare it right at the top as a string. Now, instead of having a message box display this message value, we will assign this message value to our newly created error reason string variable. So when we have an error, we will assign the error reason to our error reason variable, and then we will send an error email using the error reason in the body of the email. Now let's copy this logic to the rest of the error messages. And for the last part, we do not need a success error message, so we can just comment this out. Okay, let's save the changes. And that's it for this macro. Let's test and see if all of this is working fine. Let's first just give it a basic run through. Okay, so the macro has executed, but we did not see any success message. That's because we have commented it out. The only way to check if it ran successfully is to check whether we actually send the email. And yes, we've sent the email. Looks good. But now let's test and see whether the error emails are working. Let's test this first part. CSV file hasn't refreshed. We got the email, so that's good. I'm going to copy an old data CSV file and paste it into our project space. So now the date modified has gone to a previous date. Today's date is the 20th of the 2nd. So clean the emails. Okay, let's run this macro. Now, the expectation would be that we will get an error email saying that the CSV file hasn't refreshed. Let's go to our send folder. Great, let's come to our inbox as well. So the subject says failure to deliver aged invoice report, and the email body displays the error message. Okay, the error emails seem to be working fine. I don't think we really need to check whether the other error emails are working because we've already tested that the message box logic has been working correctly. So I'm just going to save this final version. Okay, so that's the macro. One more thing is left. We need to call this macro when the workbook opens. For this, let's go to this workbook. We need to add the code to the open event. So come to workbook, and by default, we have the open event selected. So all we have to do is call our macro in this sub procedure. So call, I'm just going to copy our macro name. And that's it. Save. Let's close this and test and see if this works or not. So the expectation is that once we double click on this file, the macro should trigger automatically. Okay, I can see something happening in the background. The file is opened and the file got sent. Looks like we've got a failure to deliver message. CSV file hasn't refreshed, and that's because we haven't updated the CSV file from the previous part of our code. Let's do that now. See, today's date is the 22nd. The CSV file though is from 3 days earlier. Let's open this up. I'm going to make a small change to it. Save, close. Date is now the 20th of the 2nd. Cool. Let's close the macro file. I'm going to delete out my emails. Okay, let's try this again. Double click on the macro file. The macro is taking slightly longer to run. Something's happened in the background. The file is opened right now. Let's go to our emails. Yes, an email has been sent. So this does show that the macro is being triggered on the workbook open event when we just open the macro file. So what have we done now? If we double click on this workbook, the macro will get triggered and we will automatically send our report file to all the email recipients. This brings us to a point that we've covered previously. So I need to add a bit of a caution out here. If you double click this file, the macro is going to get triggered and you will land up sending the email. So if you accidentally do this, you might land up sending the email in the middle of the day to all the recipients who are not expecting it. Might be a bit embarrassing. So to avoid this, there are two ways. One is the Excel way, wherein if you want to open this file without triggering the macro, we need to open the Excel application. File open, choose the macro file. Click open, but while you're clicking open, push down the shift key. So I'm going to push down my shift key, press open, and the file's opened and nothing's being sent. So that worked. But this can get a bit tricky, and I've made this mistake that I've double clicked without pressing down the shift key and some macro gets accidentally triggered. So to avoid that, we've added a fail-safe. So if you're nervous that the shift down method will not work, or you may not press the shift button down hard enough, then we've added a fail-safe. Come to email list. Come to send file. We'll set the trigger email to no. Save this. Close the file. Now let's reopen our macro directly from the Window Explorer. We did see an email get sent in the background, but don't worry, it is not the report template being sent out. It is actually a failure to deliver message that is only being sent out to you. See, we got the failure to deliver message saying that the email was aborted due to the no trigger in the email list. So that worked fine. So if you ever want to troubleshoot this file, my suggestion would be that you can go into the Excel application and press down shift and open this file. Yes, but I feel more confident with this fail-safe method. So in my work environment, I always add these fail-safes. Now we've done with the macro. I just want to add one small thing. My intention for this macro is to represent real work scenarios. But to understand that, let's talk about the next part first. What we're going to eventually do is get a Windows task scheduler to send this report template every day, which means Monday to Friday and Saturday and Sunday. Windows task scheduler has limited options. We can only set the macro to run on every day of the week, but a business week is just 5 days, Monday to Friday. If we left it at that, the macro would run every day and we would create 2 redundant emails on Saturday and Sunday. So we will need to add some code to take care of that. We will use the weekday function for that. The weekday function will return a 1 for Sunday and 7 for Saturday. So if the function returns any of those numbers, we will not run this macro. So let's dim a variable to hold the value returned by the weekday function. Weekday and today's date, which is just the date function. So if the L date is 1 or 7, let's close the if first. So if it is a 1 or 7, we will just exit this up. I'm going to remove my call function for the macro from here and paste it below this line. So we haven't called the macro up until now, which means that all we're asking this sub procedure to do is check the weekday of today's date. If it is 1 or 7, that means if it is Sunday or Saturday, it will exit the sub and no harm done. But if it is not, that means if it is Monday to Friday, it will move past this code and it will go on to call our main macro sub procedure. So now let's check this. Today is a Sunday, which means this condition will be true and we should automatically go to the exit sub part. Let's check the L date. So previously, if I open this workbook, my macro would get triggered automatically. Now let's save this, close the macro. We have created a sub procedure which will not trigger the macro if it is a Saturday or a Sunday. We're going to test that out now. Open email console. It worked. The fact that it opened quickly means that no email was sent out. Nothing in my sent, nothing in the inbox. So that worked fine. Let's test this out again. So Saturday is a 7. Let's remove the Saturday condition. Imagine we are doing a 6-day work week. So now we're setting this macro to not run if it is Sunday. But if it is any day from Monday to Saturday, will run. Let's save this. Let's close this. Close the macro. Come back out. Let's double click on it. It should run this time. So the macro has been triggered. Come to the Outlook email. Something's being sent. The template wasn't generated because we had selected the trigger to be no in the previous part of this video, which is fine, but it does still prove that the macro was triggered on open. So before we move on, I'm just going to change the trigger back to yes. Okay, so that's it for the macro. There's just 2 parts left now. We're going to create a .bat file and then we're going to create a Windows task schedule to open the .bat file, which in turn will trigger our macro. Now, let's create the .bat file. The purpose of the .bat file is to open the Excel macro through the Windows task scheduler. Let's open a new Notepad file. I'm just going to paste in 4 lines of code out here first. This is the basic code to open any Excel file. All we need to do out here is to add in a file path. So let's do that now. Copy the folder path. Paste it here. Put in the backslash. Copy the macro file name. Rename. Copy. Paste it here. Now let's save this file. Let's give it a name. Now if you click save, it'll just get saved the .text file, but you want to save it as a .bat file. So let's add that extension, hit save, and see out here, our .bat file is created. So as of now, if we double click this .bat file, our macro file will get opened and in turn, the macro will be triggered and we will receive our report template email. All you really need to know out here is that to add the file path after the excel.exe and save this file as a .bat file. I'll just quickly go through the steps of what we're doing out here. At echo off prevents the commands from being displayed in the command prompt. This is our command prompt. Push T and pop D work in pairs. This command pair changes the location of the current directory. Push T along with this symbol changes the current directory to the location of where the batch script file is saved, and pop T resets it back to the default system32 location. What does this do? This allows our .bat file or the batch file to run from any location on the computer. Finally, we have a start excel.exe. What does this do? This opens the Excel application, and since we have provided a file path in front of it, it opens the Excel application and then it opens the file as well. So let's close the file. Now let's test if the .bat file is working. If we double click this .bat file, it should open the email console.xlsp file, and since we have the macro attached to the workbook open event, the macro should get triggered and we should receive an email with the report template in our inbox. Let's do that now. I can see the Excel application opening. Our email console file has opened. It's taking time to open, which means that the macro is definitely being triggered. Let's come to Outlook. Let's come to the send folder. Okay, the email is being created. I can see the send message coming here. And yes, the email has been sent. So that means the .bat file is working correctly. Let's now move on to the last part, which is creating a Windows task schedule. Now, for the final part of our code, let's go to Windows Task Scheduler and create a daily task to open the .bat file every day at 6 AM. I'm going to search for task scheduler. There is the app. Let's go to action, create task. Let's give the task a name. If you want to run this task at 6 a.m. when you are not around, you would need to choose run whether the user is logged on or not. However, for that, please note that you do not need to be signed in, but the computer does need to be turned on. For the purpose of this video though, and to show you all an example of the Windows task schedule working, I'm going to select run only when the user is logged on. Next, let's go to triggers, create a new trigger, come to daily, and we can type in 6 a.m. out here. This will ensure that this task runs at 6 a.m. daily. However, for the purpose of this video again, I just want to show this task runs once. So I will select one time and I will select a time that is just a few minutes away from now. Come to actions, create a new action. Yes, we want to start a program. And what do we want to open? We want to open the .bat file that we have created. Open. No need to place any arguments or start-ins. Okay. Come to conditions. We don't need to set anything in conditions or settings. Click OK. I've set the task to run at 6:15. So let's just wait for it to trigger. It's 6:15. I can see something happening. The Excel file is opening now. Let's come to Outlook. Come to our sent folder. The email has been created. You can see sending below. And great, the email has been sent. Everything seems to be working fine. And that's it for the project. Okay, so we have covered good ground in this project, both in terms of coding and error handling. There's always more you can do. For example, I intentionally leave the main macro workbook open after the procedure runs. This is just my preference. But you could always close the file if you want. Just close the workbook at the end of the procedure in the open workbook event. Similarly, there's always more error handling that you could add. But to keep this video series short, I have just included the error handlers that I feel are most important. The code for this project will be on our website, skillsandautomation.com, and I'll post the link below. I hope this video has been informative for y'all. I did enjoy compiling it together. I do intend to keep posting such projects and tutorials. If this is something you would be interested in, please do consider subscribing to our channel. Okay, see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.